Hi, welcome to StatStuff. I'm Matt Hansen. Okay, picture this. You're the prosecutor of a tough court case where it's your responsibility to find enough evidence that will convince the jury to convict a suspect beyond a reasonable doubt. Alright, maybe it's not that serious, but what I want to introduce to you in this lesson is the concept of hypothesis testing, which in many ways is like the situations we may see like that on a TV crime drama. Well, maybe it's not as serious as a murder trial, but the concepts are very similar and serve as a great example for discussing the topic of hypothesis testing. Now, there are no prerequisites for this lesson, so let's begin by trying to compare the hypothesis testing with an example from our judicial system.
Again, when we want to look at the hypothesis testing, we're going to use this example of the American judicial system. So in a typical courtroom of the judicial system in America, we've got these types of roles of people that are involved, and we'll adapt that here to a Six Sigma typical project. First of all, we've got the defendant that's in the courtroom. That's the person who's on trial, the one who's trying to defend themselves from whatever they're being accused of. Well, it's pretty similar to like the root cause. It's the whole reason why we have a project in the first place. It's what's causing the problems that led us to create the project, and it's what we want to solve. So this is why we're meeting in the first place, in the same way that the defendant is usually why we're meeting in the courtroom in the first place of the judicial system. Well, also then we have a prosecutor. The prosecutor might be representative of the Six Sigma black belt. That's the person who's leading the case, the person who's leading this entire project in this example, where they're the ones who are gathering all the evidence, the one who's working with all the team members and everyone involved to do the interpretation, everything related to applying the Lean Six Sigma tools and concepts in order to figure out what is the root cause and try to solve that root cause that's causing all the problems in the first place. Then we also have the witness or the evidence that's usually used to help build the case for the prosecutor. Well, that might be represented in the data analysis. It's all the proof, all the evidence that's used to support why this is the root cause. Well, in the same way, that's what a typical Six Sigma black belt might do when they're leading a project. They try to gather some data evidence that is the proof that they need to prove that this is the root cause and this is what needs to be fixed. And we also have the jury, the people in the back here. These are the folks that make the actual determination of whether they're going to believe the prosecutor and agree with the prosecutor to say that this is the defendant that's guilty. Well, in the same way, in a project, it might be represented the sponsor or the champion. These are the people that we're trying to convince that this is the root cause, this is what we need to do, and this is the type of action you might need to take in order to fix this root cause. So it's usually the sponsor, the champion, ultimately, that we're trying to convince because they're the ones who have all the power and resources in order to make the necessary changes in order to resolve the root cause. And then finally, we've got the judge. The judge is the one who presides over all the proceedings going on in the courtroom to make sure everyone follows procedures. Well, that might be similar to like a certain peers or a mentor or a master black belt, someone who would be overseeing a project and support for the project to make sure, hey, as the prosecutor actually, well, in this case, as the Six Sigma black belt, followed all the necessary rules in interpreting the data and evidence that's being used. Did they use the right test? Did they follow the right logic? And are they interpreting it correctly and how they're communicating it back to the sponsor or champion? The kind of overseeing it can be that kind of support in that way. So again, based off of all these different roles that are involved in a project, we're going to extend this example a little bit further to see how we adapt that to hypothesis testing.
Okay, now let's formally define what we mean by hypothesis testing.
Hypothesis testing refers to the formal method for statistically testing and validating the data for differences between two different factors. It's a method where we're taking one factor at a time and we're seeing how it influences the ultimate output. So we're taking one factor at a time, typically like an X, which is the input, and seeing how that influences the output or the Y. So what's the purpose of hypothesis testing? Well, what we want to do is we want to find the evidence that will statistically prove what's the root cause for the original problem that's in our project. So again, how does this fit into our whole judicial system example that we used? Well, it's representing all the testing and analysis that's done on the evidence before the trial even begins. So before we go to trial, we have to make sure we do all this testing of the evidence ahead of time. That is, in running a project, we need to make sure we get all the evidence and data and do all the analysis ahead of time before we can actually prove this is the root cause and here are the fixes we might need to put in place to fix that root cause. So just like in the judicial system example, the burden of proof is going to be on the prosecution. They have to provide the sufficient evidence in order to convict the defendant. Again, in our example, that's the root cause. So in the same way, for hypothesis testing, that's what we use in order to validate the evidence is sufficient enough to prove what the root cause really is. So in the judicial system example, what if the prosecution doesn't have evidence or not sufficient evidence? Well, if the prosecution can't fulfill the burden of proof that's on them, then their case is typically going to be dismissed. Well, in the same way, if we don't have sufficient evidence to prove what's the root cause, then the project may be at risk. And it's at that point that we need to really assess, is it worth continuing on with the project or not? If we don't have a proper data to prove what's the root cause, then how can we have any confidence that any improvements we put in place are really going to fix that root cause? So it's at this point we need to really figure out, do we go forward or not?
Now let's talk about one of those most critical aspects of analysis, and that's gathering the evidence.
Well, when there's a crime that needs to be solved, it's usually the police that gather and analyze the evidence, and they'll do it usually in the same way that we might do it following the DMAIC methodology. Remember, the DMAIC methodology of Six Sigma is what we're using as the steps for how we would normally solve a problem when we don't know what the root cause is. Well, in the same way, the police are using similar methods to solve their crime when they don't know who the suspect is. So they have to be very careful in how they collect that data. Well, in the same way, we follow through those 5 basic steps again for the DMAIC methodology and how we adapt that to problem solving. It starts off with a define phase. Again, that's where we're trying to understand the problem. And then from there we go to the measure phase where we're trying to gather reliable information. Again, that's similar to the police who are looking at the crime scene, trying to make sure they collect all the necessary evidence and do it in a trustworthy manner so that way they can trust the information they're collecting and they can trust the reliability of the information that they're collecting. Once they've got that data collected, they go on to what we're calling the analyze phase in DMAIC, which is where we're trying to identify the root cause. And it's from there that we use the information that we've collected in order to really identify what truly is the root cause. In the same way the police might do that with the data that they have collected and all the evidence they collected in order to find who that primary suspect is. And then we move on to the improve phase where we're trying to fix the root cause, and then finally onto the control phase where we want to sustain the improvement. Now you got to remember, the measure phase, I believe, is one of the most critical phases that we have in the whole DMAIC methodology. But unfortunately, many organizations, when they walk through this whole process of trying to resolve a problem, they very often neglect this phase, which is what we're calling the measure phase, where we're trying to gather reliable information. Too often, if they're not really confident in knowing the Six Sigma methodology and the tools and concepts behind that, then they're not really aware of how critical the measure phase is. And that way they usually forego following all the stringent processes and steps necessary in the measure phase because they believe it just takes too much time. They think they can trust the data. Well, unfortunately, what they're really compromising sometimes is the reliability of the data and how they're collecting it. Well, in the same way, the measure phase is when we're doing that. We're trying to gather that information in a way that's going to become our evidence to prove what's the root cause. Well, just like in the crime scene, when police are gathering the evidence, they need to make sure they trust it, and they're very meticulous in how they gather all the evidence that's at the crime scene because they're looking carefully to make sure that they collect all the necessary fingerprints, that all the other things that could have DNA or all those things that might be necessary to help point to who the primary suspect is that they don't know yet. And this is the information they'll want to make sure they collect it in a reliable way, and they're very careful about it because they don't want to compromise it. And if they compromise it, then their whole case could fall apart. So it's essential for them to collect it. And in the same way, we need to have as much care sometimes in collecting the data so that we can trust the data in the measure phase. So we need to make sure that as we're gathering our evidence, we're gathering our data, we want to be able to validate that. Because eventually when we move, like we are now, into hypothesis testing, this is where we want to have that confidence in the data that was collected. Because if we don't have confidence in the data is not going to be reliable. It'll be pretty much useless. And if the data is useless and we can't trust it in the hypothesis testing, then it's never going to help us prove what the root cause is to lead to a solution. So it all starts with the measure phase that will help support us now as we're moving into this hypothesis testing.
Okay, so we've gathered all the evidence. So now let's talk about how we can examine all the evidence.
When we examine the evidence, we're going to use an approach that's very similar to how police might examine evidence that they're following. So let's walk through that example. First question they might ask is, who committed the crime? Well, they might have several suspects that they're going to be looking at. So let's just say for one of those suspects, they move on to the next question, which might be, is suspect B guilty? Well, the thing that they have to look for determining if they're guilty or not is to look at means, motive, and opportunity. Means being how did they commit the crime, motive being why did they commit the crime or what's the incentive behind it, and opportunity being when and where did they actually commit the crime. And then it's not just enough to get those three, but they have to link the crime together. That is, how is the suspect somehow linked to the actual crime? So again, it's not enough just to get the means, motive, and opportunity, but we have to somehow link them together, link the suspect all the way to the crime in order to prove guilt. Well, in the same way as the evidence is examined for each of these different suspects, like the police might normally follow in our judicial system example, each of the factors that we're looking at is going to be examined in the data. So we need to take it one factor at a time. And in the same way, just as evidence must link the suspect to the crime as we showed above, in the same way hypothesis testing may be necessary in order to prove the means, motive, and opportunity, but not stop there, but we must move on to compiling all the evidence that compellingly links the suspected factor, that is the one that is the root cause, to help us prove whether that really is the root cause, the true root cause of the problem.
Just like in a court case, let's talk about how we must be gathering proof beyond a reasonable doubt.
Well, how much proof is actually needed for convicting what we're calling the root cause? Well, again, if we go back to our American judicial system, a suspect is considered innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Well, in the same way, when we're doing prudent data analysis, we presume innocence on each of the factors that we're analyzing until we have enough data that proves that it's guilty. That's basically what hypothesis testing does. It's assuming or presuming innocence on the factor. And it's what's called a null hypothesis. And if we don't have enough data to prove that it's innocent, then that means there's enough data to prove that it's probably the alternative that we're going to accept. The alternative in this case, like saying it's guilty. And it's going to measure reasonable doubt using things called the alpha and beta error types, or different levels of risk. And we're going to get into that in just a couple minutes. So we might ask ourselves then, how much evidence is actually needed for proof beyond a reasonable doubt? Well, we don't have to have everything be 100% facts or pure absolute truth in order to convince the jury of whether something is going to be considered guilty or whether it's really the root cause or not. But it really depends on the jury, who we're trying to convince. In this case, for a project, that would be a sponsor or champion. So again, we don't have to have absolute proof in order to convince them necessarily, but just enough to tip the scale in the direction where they believe us and agree beyond a reasonable doubt of what the root cause is. This is similar to what we've talked about in the past in the ABC model that was talked about in the lesson in the introduction series of lessons. So again, that's where we talked about how we're looking for what arguments are there that would help persuade the beliefs of the sponsor and champion in order to help them make the right conclusions. That's really what we're looking for. Again, when we go back to the ABC model where we talked about the belief scale and the different types of arguments and the different weights of these arguments that we would add to our belief scale, it's basically looking at the decisions that those sponsor or champion might make, the decisions that they're making that typically they might be making on assumptions or personal experience, things that are much lighter weight, and we want to try to shift the weight to be something much heavier by adding more data and analysis and using this hypothesis testing that's going to help make it more scientific in the approach. And by doing that, it's going to help add more weight to one side of the scale. It's going to tip their belief in one direction or another once we have that data. And by tipping the belief in one direction or another, it's going to help influence the conclusions or decisions they're making that will give them more confidence that they're making the right decision that would lead them to the right actions. Now let's talk about how we're going to measure statistical risks like we would normally do in hypothesis testing. And as I just introduced into the last slide, we talked about the alpha and beta level of risks. These are two basic measurements that are used for measuring risk when we're doing hypothesis testing. So to help explain these, let's assume that we have an empty glass. And this empty glass represents all the possible evidence or data that might be about a particular issue that we want to know about a particular subject. And let's just say we're going to fill the glass with what we're calling the data or evidence. The glass is only going to be filled for as much data or evidence that we have about the particular subject. So we might ask ourselves then, how full should the glass be in order for me to make a reasonable conclusion? So if we have a whole lot of information about something, a whole lot of data to back it up, a whole lot of evidence, then the glass might be very full, enough to say this is the decision we should make because we have enough data to support it. However, if it's a subject we don't have a lot of data or evidence, it might be something very low. It's not very filled at all. And so in that case, we don't have a whole lot of data and there's a whole lot more risk involved. So the part that we don't have, the part that's not filled, might represent the risk. So let's talk about the risk. One of the risks is called an alpha risk. This might be represented as a threshold here at 95%. This alpha risk is also called a type 1 error. It represents a false positive. Usually 5% is the default level of risk. And if you notice, 5% risk, when we say 1 that is representing the entire glass minus the 5% risk, will give us 95% result. That 95% represents the confidence level. That is, we want to have the glass filled to at least 95%. So if it's at least up to 95%, that means we're 95% confident surrounding the information, data, evidence we might have around this particular subject. Then what portion is not filled, we're willing to accept up to 5% risk, or we're willing to accept up to 5% of not having enough knowledge or data behind something. So in this way, if we're going to use our judicial example again, we're saying it's like it's the risk representing where we're going to convict an innocent person. And we don't want to do that. We don't want to convict an innocent person. We want to reduce that risk as much as possible. So if we were going to apply that type of risk, that's the risk that we could be actually convicting an innocent person. So in this case, this dotted line might represent our lower threshold of reasonable doubt. That is, we want to go above the 95%. We want to go above this threshold. That is, we want to reduce this risk by 5% or less, and that's our level of reasonable doubt we're willing to accept. Or from a statistical example, we're saying it's a factor causes a difference when really it doesn't, and we don't want to do that. We don't want to assume that one factor is the root cause when it really isn't. Or from a practical standpoint, if we assume that a factor is what's really guilty, it's the root cause when it really isn't, then we're spending a whole lot of time fixing something that isn't broken. So all these are examples of this type of risk, and it's a risk that we want to avoid. And to help avoid it, we want to fill our glass up to at least 95% or higher to minimize that risk as much as possible. We're willing to accept up to 5% as a threshold for this risk, but we don't want to have more than that. Now, another type of error or another type of risk is what we call the beta risk, and this might be represented here as that threshold at 90%. This beta risk is also called a type 2 error, and it would represent a false negative. 10% is generally the default that many organizations use. It's not formal, just like 5% isn't the formal requirement for an alpha risk. But these are, if you're not sure what to use and if you don't have anything else to tell you any differently, then you might accept 5% default for alpha and about 10% default for the beta risk. So if you'd say 1 minus this beta risk, then what it's called is the power level, and that represents 90%. So this type of risk, again from a judicial example perspective, we're saying that it's the risk of acquitting a guilty man. That is, letting a guilty person go free. And we don't want to do that either. If it's really guilty, then we want to be able to convict them. And we don't want them to go free. So there is a risk that we could actually be letting somebody go free that really is guilty after all. So in that way, we might say this threshold here represents the upper threshold of reasonable trust. That is, this is as much as we're going to go to reasonably trust that maybe it is okay to let them go free because we don't have enough data to reach that particular threshold. And from a statistical standpoint, it's kind of like saying we say a factor doesn't cause a difference when it really does cause a difference. Again, that's bad. We don't want to do that. We want to make sure that if we're saying that one factor is really the root cause, we want to be confident and have enough data to really validate that it is the root cause after all. From a practical standpoint, again, it's a risk that we could be diverting our attention away from what is truly the root cause, because we want to spend our time on what is truly the root cause, and we don't want to fix something that isn't broken, which is the alpha type of risk, and at the same time, we don't want to avoid what really is the root cause. So both of these types of risks are bad if we want to minimize these as much as possible. So based off of this, then what is the ideal level of risk that we're going to need? Well, it really depends on the inherent risks of what we're analyzing. So as an example, would you accept a 5% risk as an alpha risk if we were doing pharmaceutical testing, or maybe building surgical equipment, or doing nuclear engineering? Probably not. We probably would not be willing to accept that much risk. We probably would want something much less. So if in that example, one of those organizations that does, let's say, nuclear engineering, if they only wanted to accept 1% risk, well, in that case, their alpha risk they would define as 1%, which means the confidence level would be 1 minus the 1%, or in that case, the confidence level would be 99%. Or maybe even 1% is too much, so they might reduce it even more too. The point is that any organization can set their own level of risks, but if you're not sure which one to set, then you might accept 5% as the default for the alpha risk, 10% is the default for the beta risk. Most statistical tests, when you're going to do some analysis though, are just going to ask for the confidence level, or it might actually ask for the alpha risk. So they're not going to usually ask for the beta risk or the power level at all, but it is important to keep that in mind, because what's really important is to really understand what falls between these levels of risk. And this is where a lot of folks really don't capture this when they consider alpha risk and beta risk. So again, let me stress this point here. The point is we want to get our data or evidence either below 90% or above 95%. We do not want to have our level of data or evidence in between this gap. That is very bad if it's between the gap. If we want it below 90% because, again, this 90% represents our upper threshold of reasonable trust. That is, we don't have enough data to convict it as the root cause, so that's okay. We're going to let it go free, and we feel good about it because we have enough data to say there might be something there, but not enough to really prove that it's there, so it's enough for us to trust that it really is probably not the root cause after all. However, at the same time, if we do have enough data that tips us over the 95% threshold, then that's reducing this alpha risk. And that's, again, a good thing in the sense that we have a whole lot of data to give us confidence that we're really convicting the true guilty party after all, because we're reducing that risk as much as possible. However, if you find that your data falls anywhere between the gap of 90 and 95%, that's really bad. It's bad because you haven't a whole lot of data. You went past the point of reasonable trust. So you have a lot of data that could convict this person. Maybe they're really guilty after all. But if they're not, and if it's not enough data or evidence to go above the 95%, then that means we don't have enough data to really prove for certainty, at least with the level of risk that we want. It's not enough for certainty that this is really the root cause. So in any case, when we're doing analysis like that, if the results are coming back unexpectedly, or if we see that our data evidence from the statistical test that we'll be running falls somewhere between 90 and 95% like this, or in this case, if the p-value that comes back from a statistical test falls between 5% and 10%, well then that's where we have to test again, or get additional samples, or do some additional analysis, because it's not enough just to say that we've reduced the risk where the risk is, the p-value is above 5%. That's not enough. We have to look to see if the risk level or the p-value, if it's between 5% and 10%, we have to go back and get more data because we could be subject to this level of risk as well. So it's really important to consider both of those types of risk when we're doing our analysis.
All right, now that we have a good general idea of what hypothesis testing is, let's talk about the first 4 basic steps used in the hypothesis testing.
So at a very high level, these are the 4 steps I'm about to show you that we want to apply when we do hypothesis testing. So we're going to start off with things being from the practical and move our ways to statistical, and then move ourselves back to what's practical. So using the perspective here that's drawn out, we're going to start over here at the first box, that is starting off with a practical problem. This is where we want to define our problem as a practical yes or no question. Real simple. Keep it simple, like a yes or no, a closed-ended question like that. That's where we want to start it off from a practical way. Then we move on to the statistical problem. That is where we want to convert that original problem now to some analytical question that's going to help us identify what's the statistical tool or the method that we're going to apply in order to help analyze and resolve the problem. And then from there, after applying the tool, we're going to come up with a statistical solution. That's where we're going to interpret the results of the hypothesis test with an analytical answer. Something, again, keeping it relatively statistical, where we're doing the interpretation of that problem and the interpretation of the results of that test that we applied. And then finally, from there, once we have the statistical solution, we're going to come up and convert that to a practical solution. We want to interpret it in such a way that it makes sense, and we want to make it a practical, relevant way so we can apply it and apply it effectively. So it's steps 2 and 3. This is really the heart of hypothesis testing, and this is where we're going to spend most of our time in doing the analysis. And we're going to dig a little bit deeper as well as we explore the formal method and informal methods for how we're going to take things from a practical problem and convert it to the statistical problem, and how we're going to go through the process of coming up with a statistical solution, because it's really the heart of where hypothesis testing is.
All right, before we close this lesson, let's discuss how we can apply some of these concepts in a practical way.
Well, try to think of at least 2 different projects or initiatives that you worked on in the past in your organization, and ask yourself the following questions. First of all, how confident are you, like from a percentage standpoint, how confident are you that the results or those conclusions you came to from those projects were actually correct? Now, what are you basing that confidence on? If your confidence is something that's less than 95%, then what are some of those reasonable doubts that you might have had about the accuracy of those results? Now, if you were asked to actually present those examples, those different projects, in a real legal case in court, then would you have a different level of confidence about it? And if not, then why wouldn't it be the same? And also, would you change the data or analysis that was done before submitting it as evidence in a real legal case? If so, then what changes would you make and why would you make those changes? And are those changes indicative of some risks that you or maybe other folks have overlooked in the project or initiative itself? If so, then why were those changes overlooked, and why weren't those further analyzed or validated in order to mitigate that potential risk?
Well, that wraps up this lesson. Check out StatStuff.com for many more resources that can help you achieve powerful results. I'm Matt Hansen. Thanks for watching.